So if here I have one quotation from one migrant, Tara, and she's talking about while she was crossing the road, somebody grabbed her, and how that made her become very careful, and that every time she saw a scooter coming towards her, she would always kind of try and hide or grab onto something so that she doesn't have to face another kind of incident like that. So it shows you how one incident, even if it doesn't get repeated, it kind of gets imbibed in your being, and you get kind of become fearful, and you kind of relive the same horror over and over again in your daily life, because a scooter will definitely come. Whether that scooter is going to hit you or not, that's a different matter. But being fearful that it might is at the essence of people's, yeah, women's direct experiences of interpersonal violence. Then the second one is discursive violence, and I talked about how these are kind of violences that are embedded in social discourses and in norms, which were used for women to exclude them from public spaces, and also to tell them that they are victims and or potential victims in public spaces. So how women's experiences and fear of violence, they were socially operationalized as discursive tools, and to kind of construct them as vulnerable, and also to control their access to and practices in public space. So here Advaita, she's a North Indian migrant, 27 years old, and she talked about this particular incident when when she was taking a walk in this green area in Delhi, which is known as the Ridge. I don't know if anybody knows about it, but she's talking about these two elderly men who came towards her and her friend to tell them that it is extremely unsafe for young women to walk at 9 p.m. So they called us brave with a lot of sarcasm. I could sense the disappointment in their voice. They were thinking that because young girls are not careful, incidents happen. And sometimes that they did not mention explicitly, and something that they did not mention explicitly, but rigged off in their sarcastic, paternalistic comment. However, I felt, or we felt, liberated to pull off such a stance. So this is the kind of violence where even when you are not fearful, or even when you are trying to be brave, right? There are social discourses, and there are so people around you who are not really known to you would come up to you in the city and said, "Oh, you know what? This is not right for you to do because you are potentially vulnerable to violence." So this is the form of discursive violence that goes on against women all the time. So they'll give you all sorts of advice as to when to go out, when not to go out, where to be, where not to be, how to live, where not to live, and blah blah. Lots that I have heard over the last 16 years of my living in Delhi. So the third part, then I looked at how these forms of everyday and unspoken forms of violence take a structural root. So here I analyzed in social institutions and structures, and I looked at women's hostels and their regulations over um, women, and how they kind of frame that around the issue of violence and fear and protection of women in these living in these hostels. So they had three kinds of controls, and three kinds of which are kind of spatial, temporal, and bodily and social controls. So it ranged from, they had curfew timings, when you can go out, when you cannot go out. They would require parental approval for to travel outside of Delhi, even if you are going on a field visit with your university. They had to be provided with parental approval. There were entry and exit bans on holidays like Holi, because men would literally torture you during Holi on the public space. And there were other things like, what to wear, what not to wear, who can visit you, who cannot, and what are the kind of disciplinary actions if you or somebody you have known has violated some of these rules and regulations. So resilience then in this context becomes very it becomes part and parcel of being a woman in Delhi, in a sense, because you have to constantly negotiate. Like when you have a entry time in the evening for your hostel, and you are doing work, say in the library, and your library is open until about 12 a.m. and most libraries in some Delhi universities or Jawaharlal Nehru universities, they open. And when you're expected to leave the library and go back to your hostel at 6 p.m. just because you're a woman, then you kind of develop certain levels of tactics to kind of subvert that kind of a control on women's lives. So I divided this form of resilience, that everyday kind of resilience, into um, two types. One is speech acts, building on Judith Butler's work, and the other one is resilience or embodied practices based on Cindy Katch's work. So speech acts are essentially women's articulations and positioning of themselves in the city, alternatively as more than victims of violence, right? So here is Abha who talks about this, and I find her quotation very strong and very provocative. And she talks about that public spaces have a possibility of harm to my life and my sense of security. So she's very aware that, she can be harmed in public space. But she goes on and says that yet it is in these places that I find my freedom. It is in these places I can assert my identity, I can build an identity. It is in these places that I can truly find myself. My home does not provide me with a sort of nurturing atmosphere. I cannot be myself if I'm not using public space in my life. No matter how unsafe they are, I need them to build myself. I cannot build myself within the four walls of my home. So Avha's, it kind of echoes a lot of things. One is her women's awareness that violence happens and they are fearful. And at the same time, they also aspire to be somebody. They aspire to be like, to work, to study, to go out, to hang out with their friends, because the city provides a lot of those opportunities. And so in doing, speaking like this, in speaking this way, she is essentially redefining herself. And at the same time, she's redefining public spaces and what it means to be a woman in a public space. So the other aspects I focused on are resilient practices. So these are embodied practices, practices that we undertake using our bodies, and when we occupy public space, or when we change social relations within which women live. So the first one is she's a migrant woman, Frida. She talks about how she dresses and how that becomes very important. She talks about I don't reveal much. I try to make that a person feel comfortable with what I'm wearing, and when I am in the public space, I try not to jump around like attraction seeker, and I try not to attract any attention in the public. So then Sandhya, who's a Daliite woman born and brought up in Delhi, she talks about how her social relations, especially her family, her father asked her to stop working after the Nirbhaya case in 2013 or 2012, sorry. Nirbhaya case happened. So there was a huge protest after the Nirbhaya gang rape case in Delhi, and there has been like yearly commemorations. So using that backdrop, her father asked her to leave the job, and she said, I told him if we all start sitting at home, then people will be encouraged more to do all of these things. So I'm not going to read the whole quotation. And she said, so we should take care of ourselves, as in use a pepper spray, things like that, and try and push the boundaries. So in this Sandhya's quotation, what brings out is this interlinkage between embodied practices, the social context, and their aspirations to push the boundaries, right? Social relations, which kind of define what you should be doing or not doing. So when I took these two forms of resilience together, they represented kind of everyday forms of small acts and narratives that helped the women I was researching materially, and also allowed them to to recuperate their dignity in an everyday life in the face of violence at the multiple scale. So now the question is, so what, right? Now what do we do? What happens to the question of violence? Is it all right because all women do undertake resilient practices? And what happens to the question of sustainability and eradication of violence, right? And what happens to social justice? So in other words, The question is resilience enough, or is it sustainable, and is it just? So my short answer is no. But the long answer is quite complicated and context dependent. So while resilience is being promoted as an idiom of global governance, which I borrowed from McKinnon and Erickson 2013, it is used as a top-down approach to develop capacities of people, places, and infrastructures to external threat, such as climate change, capitalist oppression, etc. Right? But imagine what it might mean to bounce back if you think from the perspective of the women or from the ground up, or so what it means to bounce back or to be resilient in a situation where violence is endemic. So the answer to that for me is that being resilient means that you go back to the same situation of violence every day, get violated, and somehow bounce back or find a grip with the reality and face the same situation all over again. So it kind of creates this cycle of violence, inequalities, then you become resilient, and then you become again go into the same environment of violence, inequalities, erasures, and unethicality. So resilience in this context, if you think from the ground bottom up, it becomes a very pragmatic and an apolitical process, and which reproduces systems of inequalities and marginalization. So So, so it's important then if we think through issues of differences, intersectionality, and also take consideration of the scale, then we need to ask who is resilient or whose resilience are we talking about? When we say a community resilience, which community are we talking about, right? And or which people, which individuals within that community are we talking about? Because we know communities are not homogeneous, they are heterogeneous, and they are different. All of the communities are different. And what kind of resilience are we talking about, under what conditions? So what is the context? When are they going to be resilient? How are they going to be resilient? Or and why are they going to be resilient? And in the process of becoming resilient, who is left behind or who is erased from our efforts to develop a sustainable society? Remember that my presentation is based on women who are middle class, okay, who are young, able-bodied, has certain level of socioeconomic and political power and legitimacy to use public space. So it is probably a bit easier for them to be resilient, right? To say you to be able to use pepper spray, you will have to be able to shell out some 600 or 1,000 rupees from your pocket to buy that pepper spray, which expires in 6 months' time. So that form of resilience requires money. That forms of resilience requires social support. It is very individualistic at the same time. So can all women act in the similar ways? Probably not. So we must also look into the questions such as who is resistant, who under what conditions, when, how, and why, and who is left behind and erased. So when we see from this perspective, then resilience becomes a very reductionist and one size fits all approach, and it becomes inadequate. And furthermore, when we think of resilience and to which or threats, right? Resilience is always in kind of in relation to a risk or a threat that happens to the community, and then community is supposed to become resilient, supposed to become bounce back, they are supposed to come back to the same status, right? And most of the time resilience, the word resilience is used, or resilient societies, resilient cities, resilient communities are used in the context of say, a cyclone or earthquake or some kind of external threat that has happened to the community. But what happens when the threat or the inequality is endemic? That is, it comes from within the society where this community lives and which is historically rooted, such as gender inequalities or racial inequalities. So then, in that context, bouncing back or being resilient actually upholds that system in the long run. Okay, so so a truly resilient social system, from if we think about the case of women's violence against women, and in the context of Delhi, then a truly resilient social system will require actually the disruption, reorientation, and rethinking of the system of oppression, which is happening at multiple scales, as I discussed with the three types of violence: multi-sided, happening in hostels, public spaces, happening within families, and these are historically rooted. So, gender inequality in India or anywhere else in the world actually is historically being reproduced. So, we require a system which is um, which is completely different than a resilient system. So in order for that, so then we need to move towards sustainability and justice. And I think this is where sustainable development goals are becoming very important, right? So, but even when we are talking about sustainable development, we have to constantly think about justice. And how do we do it from a feminist perspective is that we take into account the intersectionality, that when we talk about a group or a community, we look into what are the kind of different kinds of power relations we are talking about. Are they homogeneous caste-wise? If they are homogeneous caste-wise, what about gender? What about income? What about where they live? What about access to water? What about access to, say, healthcare? So there can be thousands of things which you can, I mean, as researchers and as teachers, we can think of. You know, we are aware because we live in the same society, and which may make a lot of difference in how they experience development, how they experience risk, and how they experience resilience. So intersectionality and difference must be a part of this kind of a development approach. The other thing is to think about scale. So if I can go back to my own research and about the women, so when you look at one person, say for example the woman who was using pepper spray and telling her father that she's not going to sit inside the house because that's going to create more violence. If I look at that one person, it might look like a wow. I mean, that is something so great, right? She's changing her family in some ways. But if I move beyond that scale of the family and the individual, I can also see that how neoliberal and how class oriented that particular moment of resilience is. Because she requires a pepper spray, which requires money for you to buy, which requires a particular kind of setting where you can use it, right? And which is not available to everyone. So then taking the next, analysis of scale, in this context, class and access to resources. I mean, a woman of the same class background sitting in a rural home will not be able to do that because she might not have access to these kind of facilities. So scale becomes a very important part, and it provides perspectives about how one kind of inequality and one kind of oppressive system is connected to the other systems of existence and development. And then becomes the second thing is about temporalities. Not everybody can be resilient and sustainably developing at the same point of time. So you'll have to, everybody's development goals and development trajectories will be different, and it will be happening at different times. And the third final thing is about historical embeddedness of the problem. So sometimes when I look at issues such as resilient cities, and we must ask about how are we defining that risk. Sometimes the risk can be the immediate thing, but that immediate thing is actually a result or a symptom of historical inequalities. For example, what we see today as climate change and resilient cities. In the context of climate change, we are talking about developing cities who are flood resistant, but that flood is not happening. It's just a symptom that is showing up today, and because of hundreds of years of unsustainable development, right? So if we are not if we follow the same path of development that has been followed in the 100 years prior to this flood, we will not be able to stop the flood, no matter how much resilient cities or societies we continue to build. So historical embeddedness and understanding that embeddedness is important. So I think this is more or less what I have to say. So, final sentences is so for sustainable development and justice, then I advocate that we need to move beyond resilience and towards more transformative changes. So, thank you.